Hello, everyone. Today we're looking at religious change in Elizabethan England, and we're going to understand why changes in religion cause problems for regular Elizabethans, people like you and I. Now, below we have three different images, and we're going to use these to try to remember the names of the three religions we learned about last lesson. Now, the first image was the old religion in England. They like to have lots of decorations, lots of gold, because they believed the more decoration you had, the more you loved God. We then had another religion here. These people believed that all the decorations were too fancy and showy, and you didn't need decorations to show your devotion to God. You just had to go to church. And then we had this group here, and they believed to rule the church by an elected committee, a group of people who would run it as a community. And they said that you don't need any decorations inside because those are a waste of time. Now, going back to our first image, if you're thinking that these are Catholics, you're absolutely correct. Or second, if you're thinking of Protestants, you're right. And the third, that very pure form of religion, would be the Puritans. Now, if you need any more information about those three religions, please refer back to our previous lesson about religion in Elizabethan England, and hopefully those will answer your questions. Otherwise, just make sure you send your teacher an email. So looking at the monarchs in the Tudor era, we're going to go from 1509 up to 1558, and we just need to put the names in order. The first name that we need to know is a king who has a reputation for not being too lucky when it comes to marriage, and that's going to be Henry VIII. He became king in 1509. Now, when Henry dies in 1547, he has three children. The first one to take the throne will not necessarily be the oldest, but it will be the oldest male. That's going to be Edward VI. In 1553, he passes away. Mary I, also known as Bloody Mary, will take the throne, and she will stay in power for roughly 5 years to when Elizabeth will then take control. The next thing we have to do is figure out who is who. Now, some of these may be a bit easier than others. So if you want to just take a moment to have a look at our four different images, try to figure out who would match up with Henry, Edward, Mary, and Elizabeth. So here we have Henry VIII, his son Edward VI, Mary I, and Elizabeth I. Now here's a trick to remembering the religions of each monarch, something we'll go into a little bit more depth in on the next slide. Henry was a Catholic, and he had to change religion so he could get a divorce from his wife, Catherine of Aragon. Long story short, he wanted a divorce because he wasn't having a boy. He kept having girls, and he believed it was his wife's fault. So when he asked the Pope for a divorce, the Pope said, no, you can't divorce your wife just because she's giving birth to girls. And Henry decided to leave the Catholic Church, and he was going to form his own Protestant church known as the Church of England. Edward was a strong Protestant, Mary was a strong Catholic, and Elizabeth was a Protestant. Now, the trick to remembering is it just goes Catholic to Protestant, Catholic, and back to Protestant. So here we have a visual representation of the religious change taking place in Elizabethan England. We can see Henry VIII. He's a Catholic, but he's on his way down to becoming a Protestant, like his son Edward VI. Mary is going to change the religion of the nation again to become Catholic, as it was under the rule of Henry. But Elizabeth is going to position herself in the middle, and we call this the middle way approach. Elizabeth did not want to make the country become strictly Protestant, as she was, but she also couldn't let the country remain being Catholic. So she needed to find a compromise, something that would keep everybody happy. So a little bit more information about each monarch that we can relate back to that roller coaster. So we know that Henry VIII is going to change from being a Catholic to a Protestant. And some facts about him is he actually wrote a book about how great Catholicism was, and the Pope gave him the title Defender of the Catholic Faith. But in 1534, he broke from the Catholic Church when the divorce between he and Catherine of Aragon was refused by the Pope simply because he wasn't having any sons. So we have our first change from Catholic to Protestant. Edward was only 9 when he became the king. He died at 15. He was a really sickly child. He was often finding himself ill. He wasn't very healthy. So dying at the age of 15, I know today we would say that's quite young, but in the Elizabethan era, that wasn't entirely uncommon to pass away at such a young age. He was also the first member of the monarchy to allow priests to marry. He had a bit more of a liberal view. For the most part, priests were resigned to a life of being single. Mary the First is going to change the religion from being Protestant back to being Catholic. And she had very strong Catholic views. She got her nickname Bloody Mary for burning 300 Protestants at the stake. Now, burning at the stake was a relatively common but also gruesome method of execution. And oftentimes, people who were burned at the stake didn't die from the flames themselves, they died from lack of oxygen and inhaling too much smoke from the fire. Mary, she married the Catholic king, King Philip of Spain, and many Protestants fled abroad to Switzerland when Mary became in charge of the country. They knew that if they stuck around, they would be persecuted by her, so they decided to go off to Switzerland for a little while. There they met a guy named John Calvin, who taught them a lot more about Protestantism, and eventually these very strongly believing Protestants would return to England after Mary's death. Now, Elizabeth came up with this middle way approach, also known as via media. And that literally means to go the middle way. The church was technically Protestant that she would make, but it had Catholic traditions and some of the decorations just to keep everybody happy. Now, Elizabeth, although she wanted people to be happy, she had to be quite strict. And she gave a name to people of recusants who refused to go to her new church. And she made them pay a fine. And at first, the fine was quite low. It was only about 12p, which most people could afford in those days. But she raised it up to £20, which was an extortionate amount of money to make sure that people were going to church. Now, because of the changes that Elizabeth was making, there were several attempts against her life made by Catholic extremists. And sometimes people say that the Catholics were trying to kill Elizabeth. And for the most part, Catholics in England weren't all that bothered by the changes that she was making. They did understand that she was changing the Catholic country to be one that was kind of Catholic, but mostly Protestant. It was the extremists who were making the attempts against the Queen's life. So, some quick facts that we need to know. And this is going to establish a little bit of context for us to understand why religion was such a big deal. Now, scientific knowledge was in its infancy in the early 16th century. Microscopes didn't exist, so there was a very limited understanding of how bacteria and germs affected people. People didn't really understand the importance of good hygiene. Essentially, if you didn't absolutely stink, you were probably clean enough. And understanding of the world was simply not as clear as what we may see or what we may believe to have today. An example of this is if somebody got ill, they would often look to religion for an answer rather than trying to question, am I clean? Am I eating food that's properly cooked? Now, many, if not most questions, as we said, were answered through religion. So, some questions people might ask: why am I ill or why am I healthy? Why does the sun rise and set? Why is it raining outside? Why am I rich or why am I poor? So, why am I feeling ill? Well, people in the Elizabethan era didn't really wash that often. They would often throw their waste from their indoor toilets into the River Thames. They would then go down and bathe in the Thames. They would then use the Thames to catch their food. And they would be getting all this contaminated water on their skin and they would be drinking it. They didn't understand that this bacteria was harming them. All they understood was, I am sick. And the only explanation is, God is angry at me. So, for these reasons, it was really important to understand that religion was the primary element in people's lives. Religion, it was more than faith, it explained the unexplainable. And we always have to remember that religion was the most important thing in people's lives. So here we can see two churches we have on the left our Catholic Church, on the right we have our Protestant Church. And even though they look relatively similar from the outside, they are different on the inside. Down here we have our Elizabethan man, and he is alive when Henry leaves the Catholic Church. Now, that means people are no longer going to be going to the Catholic Church, they're going to be going over to our new Protestant church. Not many people are really happy about this because they're afraid that they're not going to get into heaven if they don't keep going to the church they've always known to be the right one. King Edward is going to maintain the Protestant faith as well. So here he goes over to the Protestant church. Now it's going to go to this church for a little while. The next thing we'll see is when Edward dies in 1553, Mary's going to change everyone's religion back to being Catholic. Now, that means that this man here and he and his family has been going to the Protestant church for over 40 years. And that's really, in some cases, 2 generations. Some people were happy to go back to being Catholic because they never wanted to become Protestant in the first place, but other people were angry because they were raised as Protestants and now they're being told to convert back to another religion. Now, when Mary dies, Elizabeth is aware that not many people are going to be happy about changing religion a third time. So she has to find some common ground. She's thinking to those people who went from being Catholics to Protestants back to Catholics and now potentially having to be Protestants again. But remember, because religion is the most important thing in people's lives, Elizabeth, as a Protestant, has to make sure that people are becoming Protestant themselves. She knows that if she pushes people too much, she could risk a rebellion or even a war. But if she doesn't force them to be a Protestant, she herself will not get into heaven. So Elizabeth is in a difficult spot, and she's going to put our Elizabethan man somewhere in the middle between the two churches. So we've got 3 questions to look at. These are going to just stay on the screen for you. Encourage you to pause the video for a few moments. You can have a chance to think about each question. Why were people so angry with the constant change in religion? And again, think back to the context. What did religion mean to these people? What did Protestants do when Mary became the Queen of England? And our last question, why did Elizabeth make a choice to use a middle way approach? So pause the video, have a moment or two to think, and when you're ready, come back and we'll take them up together. Right, let's have a look at our first question. Why were people so angry with the constant change in religion? If you said anything along these lines, you're absolutely correct. Religion was the most important element of people's lives. Going to a new church was confusing. They didn't like it. They didn't like changing religions. And they felt that being loyal to their religion was really the way to be accepted into heaven later in life. Looking at what Protestants decided to do when Mary became queen, if you said that they left for Geneva, Switzerland for safety, and their faith grew stronger as they waited there patiently to return to England, you might have even mentioned that they went under the teachings of John Calvin, who was a Protestant preacher based in Geneva. And lastly, why did Elizabeth make a choice to use a middle way approach? Elizabeth understood that her population wouldn't accept another religious change. They'd gone from being Catholics to Protestants back to Catholics under Mary, and potentially back to being Protestant under Elizabeth herself. She didn't want a war to erupt within England, and with a new church, she could make it mostly Protestant, but she could also keep some of those Catholic decorations and traditions to keep Catholics happy. Okay, now it's time for our bonus facts. No wonder Mary was so mean. She earned the name Bloody Mary. This is her actually pictured with King Philip of Spain. She was first engaged at the age of 2 to a French prince, but that engagement fell apart. So then she was set to marry her own cousin, Charles V of Austria. At the time, he was over 16 years older than she was. That relationship fell apart. That engagement was terminated. And then she was set to marry Philip of Spain. He was 11 years younger than her. So throughout her life, she had 3 engagements, 2 of which failed. One when she was only 2 years old, and another with a man who was significantly older than her. Queen Elizabeth had quite a nasty side to her. Oftentimes, when we look at Queen Elizabeth, we see her as a very strong and powerful queen. And that is very true. She was extremely well educated and very intelligent, but there are some other things that are a bit lesser known about her. When Elizabeth would get angry, she would swear and even spit on people when she was mad. She often refused to listen to her advisors, and she was very, very strong-willed and extremely opinionated. So that's it on our lesson today. Please have a look on Show My Homework, complete the quiz, and any other tasks set by your teacher.